the world's 11th largest economy, ranking 15th out of 140 countries in global competitiveness and first in macroeconomic stability. The Chamber is here in Seoul, the thriving capital city of Korea, to offer comprehensive coverage of the Korean and global economies. I'm your host, Panita Bajaj. This week on the program, we are going to learn more about Korea's economic market from a non-Korean point of view with our panelist, Todd Sample, and special guest, Chris Raciti, Chair of AustCham Korea.
So for those of you curious about Korea and what goes on around the world, we are here in Seoul, the economic hub of Northeast Asia. So without further ado, let's step into the Chamber. Hello and welcome to the studio. Once again, we have Todd Sample as well as our very special guest, Chris Raciti, AustCham of Korea. If I'm saying that correct?
AustCham, the Australian Chamber of Commerce in Korea.
All right, we have our chairman of AustCham Korea here in the studio today.
Thank you for having me.
Talking about AustCham and what exactly that is. I only know that it's been around for 10 years, started back in 2009, and is a representative body for the Australian business community in Korea. But in your words, can you explain what it exactly is?
Yeah, sure. So the Chamber, the Australian Chamber, is basically a community-based business organisation. So we work with and for our members, which are primarily Australian companies that are active here in Korea, or Korean companies that have activities in Australia. So our focus is very much on issues that are relevant to those institutions. We also look to create a network for Australian business people here in Korea. We also do a lot of advocacy work where we work with those companies, making sure that issues that are important to them are represented to various government organisations. And probably another important role that we play is CSR. So for Australian companies that are active here in Korea, they find it difficult to find avenues to do CSR work. So what I mean, community social responsibility work. So we also play an active role in facilitating that CSR work here in Korea.
Yeah, and I think with the FTA going into force in 2014, that resulted in a lot more Australian businesses coming into this local market and at least being interested in the local market. We look at the numbers. In 2013, just the year before the FTA went into force, bilateral trade volume was hovering around 30 billion US. Several years later, it was up to 38. So that's obviously a big impact that the FTA had on bilateral trade and, of course, mutual awareness of this market and in regards to the importance. Korea is also Australia's third largest export market and fourth largest trade partner. So obviously, the role for the Chamber now is growing over the last 4 years since the FTA went into force. And obviously, that means that the interest here among Australian companies is growing and probably diversifying at the same time.
Yeah, that's right. I think the FTA between Australia and Korea is quite well used. I think its usage rate is in excess of 80%, which is actually quite high for an FTA, comparatively speaking. Nature of trade is changing as well. I think historically, Australia has been very focused on providing raw materials, commodity-based products, which are used for manufacturing here in Korea. And what we've seen with the FTA is a diversification of that two-way trade into services and other goods that previously weren't getting access, respectively, to each other's markets. And I think the important thing about the relationship between Australia and Korea is we both believe in a rules-based free trade international environment. And in the current world where things are changing quite quickly in terms of various countries' attitudes towards that, it's important that middle powers like Australia and Korea retain that focus on rules-based international trade. And so the Chamber's role, one of our roles in that regard, is to continue to promote awareness of Korea as a market for Australian businesses. Obviously also promote awareness here in Korea of the opportunities that are available for Korean companies looking to expand into Australia.
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, it's really important that this becomes a two-way street rather than just a one-way street coming in. Okay, very good.
Well, trade volume, as we talked about, has increased. And I guess also safe to say that the role of AustCham Korea has also gotten a bit more important, a bit more bigger as well. Can we see how many Australian companies are here in Korea?
In terms of our member base, which is probably the best reference point for me, we've got approximately 250 active members. In terms of what makes up that base, it consists of quite a diverse number of companies and types of companies, including quite large organizations, major banks, major commodity oil and gas companies, but also small to medium businesses involved in a wide variety of sectors in the economy.
So from a tangible perspective, what would you say are some of the direct impacts that Australian companies have had on the economy here in Korea?
I think, again, it's very diverse. I think obviously Australia has been a key partner for Korea in the development that Korea has experienced over the last 50 years. We've been a major partner in providing reliable supply of raw materials that have been used for Korean manufacturing. We haven't really challenged each other. We supply things that go into manufacturing and then we buy those things back. So it's quite a symbiotic relationship in that regard.
More supportive?
We support each other.
Right, I mean, Todd, you're a business guy.
I am.
What do you got to say about that?
Yeah, well, I think when you first described what the Chamber does exactly, and obviously it's multifaceted, what you're doing, bridging the gap between Australia and Korea and vice versa. But I think one of the interesting things that he mentioned was once the companies are in Korea, now you also serve as a way to bridge them in creating closer networks with everybody. And I know AustCham has a Sundowner, it's called? Yeah, so you have a regular networking event called a Sundowner, and I think these kind of events really serve a really huge important part of the life of business people here in Korea because it closes the gap between companies that you don't know and offers you an opportunity to get together in a casual way and have a beer or two and chat with some companies that maybe you didn't even know were in the market.
Correct. Yeah. I think creating that community and that network for our members is a key objective. And I think you mentioned the Sundowners, and yes, we do Sundowners twice a year. It's essentially a business networking event. But we also do something called Doing Business in Korea, or DBIK for short, which is really focused at providing practical guidance to Australian businesses that are active here in Korea around changes in law, business practices, so that, in particular, expatriates who are coming here for work or for business have that opportunity to understand how they can be perhaps more effective in this market.
Sure. So it's not just pre-market entry, it's post-market entry.
Post-market
and
entry, correct.
once you're here,
Yeah.
trying to figure out the most efficient way to get things done.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I'm definitely curious about all this talk. I didn't know that you were part of it as well. Were you part of it, or you've been to the...
I'm not a member of AustCham, but I've been to a lot of the events, and I think that as a networker myself, and wanting to find out who's out there and what they're doing, and creating synergies with new potential partners, I think it's the casualness of the events. It's not like they're stiff events where you go there and just exchange business cards. Of course, there is the exchange of business cards, but usually you have either a glass of wine or a glass of beer in your hand, and you really get to know who's here in the business community. So a really effective way of doing that.
The original social networking.
The original social networking, yeah. And I think chambers have been around for a long time, as you said. And back in the day where really foreign companies were just expats, the chamber was really important. And at that time, it was primarily expats, but now it's integrating the Korean population as well, which is what the chamber really needs to do.
Correct. I think you raise a good point. I think if you go back 20 years, the role of the chamber was really about just creating that social network, I guess, for expatriates. Whereas now, I think our focus is creating that network, but also creating content for them in terms of, as I said earlier, how to do business in Korea. And so through that added advocacy work, I guess you could say, we help create awareness of issues and help policy makers understand different ways they could make it easier for Australian businesses that are operating here in Korea.
So I think on that point, from your perspective, how do Australian companies view the Korean investment environment?
You know, and I think it's a bit of an issue across a number of countries in this part of the world, where when companies are talking about their Asia strategy, that really is code for China strategy. And I think, you know, the size of the Chinese economy and the opportunities that presents often means that other economies in the region don't get the level of attention that they deserve. But as I said, the role of the chamber is to contribute to increasing the awareness of Korea as an opportunity for Australian businesses. We're not doing it alone. There's obviously the embassy and the trade apparatus attached to the embassy plays an important role. Also, our partner organisations in Australia, the Australia-Korea Business Council and the Australia-Korea Foundation, organisations like this all contribute to growing that awareness. And obviously our objective is to continue to grow it so that the prominence of Korea as a market in the mind of Australian businesses continues to improve.
Well, speaking of AustCham, I'm certainly a stranger to this chamber, so let's take a look inside.
AustCham, as the executive director, I guess I'm in charge of the operations on a daily basis, and my job is really on just to represent our members and find opportunities for them, teach them, and be that first port of call if they've got any issues. So the Australia and New Zealand chambers at one stage were joint, and this was obviously to help foster a fantastic relationship as we share so much in common. As years progressed, the chamber has evolved, and we've decided that we're big enough and strong enough to have two separate chambers. And we still work very closely with our New Zealand counterparts. We have a fantastic relationship, and that goes the same with many of the other chambers, including the BCCK, which is the British Chamber, CanCham, and SAFCham, and so on. So, while we all have different members, we have a lot of crossover, and it's fantastic to organise some big events and to share the knowledge that we have. So today we had a meeting with the team. We were discussing AustCham's latest premium networking event, and it's the Mid-Year Sundowner Aussie Summer Night. The event's really about just attracting the Australia and Korea community to come together and network and get to know each other, while also showcasing some of Australia's finest food and beverages. And we have some fantastic wines and beers, and also introducing a new gin into the market here, which is fantastic to really showcase what we have to offer. The event is also to really help and support and raise awareness for some of our charities, and we really look forward to raising some money and helping those less fortunate. Sugar is another big one that comes out. I think over the last 10 years, AustCham has really grown from a small social network of business like-minded individuals, and now we're seeing a diversification of businesses. Traditionally, we had a lot of companies interested in resources, but more recently, we've really grown in the financial services sector, and we have lots of interest from University Australia setting up programs over here. So I think from the small startups right through to the big companies such as our, Macquarie and Woodside Energy, we're going to really diversification and a really broad spectrum of what's happening in this relationship. And I think that just shows with some of the new committees that we set up. Recently, AustCham set up the Financial Services Subcommittee and the Energy and Resources Subcommittee. And both these subcommittees are aimed at, exploring new opportunities. And that could be from fintech, renewable energies, and even the latest craze when it comes to 5G networks. And it's a really exciting time for AustCham, and we can just see this relationship growing year on year.
Well, also as chairman of AustCham Korea, and Todd, you're also a non-Korean businessman in Korea. I think there are so many factors when it comes to investing in Korea, when it comes to small businesses, big business, or anything like that. So both of you guys, what would your opinions be? What is the nation's investment climate?
Well, I think having worked at Kotra and Invest Korea previously, which is the nation's inbound investment promotion agency, it was our job to say what a great investment environment Korea has. And of course, there are positives about being here, and depends on the sector in which you're in, and it also depends on the timing too. Not just for Australian companies, but a lot of companies in Korea, they see this country as a test market. Although we have China right next door, which is a huge market that you can't even compare Korea to, but the level of awareness of Korean consumers is quite high, and their willingness to try something, and if it goes over well here, then it's probably going to go over well in other markets in Asia, even though there are distinct differences from market to market to market, as you mentioned before. And of course the speed here. I think the way that things happen and the way that people adjust to new things and they embrace and try, considering Korea is relatively geographically isolated, I think the consumer market here has a very broad perspective and willingness to accept new things. So depending on the sector, and of course Korea is changing a lot, I think that, there are a lot of advantages to being here.
I think Korea has become very international over the last 20 years.
Yeah, since we both arrived,
since you've been here. So I'd agree with everything that Todd just said in terms of early adopters that Koreans are. The other thing that I'd add to what Todd just said is also infrastructure. I think Korea, in particular Seoul, has world-class infrastructure, which facilitates an ease of doing business. Communication, networks are obviously excellent. Technology generally is excellent. So all these ingredients contribute to, Korea's competitiveness as an economy.
Well, speaking of technology, I think nowadays one of the biggest movement that's going on, it has to do with financial services. And I didn't know, but Australia and New Zealand as well are very much for Samsung rather than Apple products. So Samsung Pay has also become quite easy for consumers to use. And it's interesting because certain countries like China are substituting banks and their services with things like WeChat or Alibaba services, and those things that are making it easier for small businesses to crowdfund now rather than going through banks, just to get investments from any person around the world. So disregarding any department of the bank and just doing consumer to consumer, small businesses to consumers and things like that. So how is that like in Australia? Are they more for Samsung Pay and these fintech?
I think this is a global phenomenon. It's not necessarily isolated to Australia or Korea, but definitely Australia is an economy or a market where these new technologies and approaches to business are growing rapidly. And I think that's an area of future cooperation between Australia and Korea, in particular fintech or fintechnology. I think Korea is quite advanced in both software and hardware associated with this industry. And Australia as a market is also actively seeking to pursue this form of disruption, and it's being supported both by government, but also major financial institutions that also want to play a role in this change in the economy. And so I think it's one area where there's a good opportunity for both Australian and Korean businesses to cooperate and really take a leading role in the changes that are coming through.
I think one of the signs of this is several weeks ago, Korea had Korea FinTech Week 2019, which brought together fintech experts from all over the world to discuss things. And one of the things that was discussed at this event was the role of innovation, but also regulation. So knowing that Australia is also quite a strong player in the fintech industry, how is the Australian government dealing with that regulation aspect, which is one of the things that people in the fintech industry are most worried about?
Yeah, I think, one thing that I'm aware that the Australian government is doing is, really creating, sandbox environments for fintech companies to safely develop and test technology and processes while still achieving the objectives of regulatory bodies in the ultimate outcomes of those products and services. So I'm aware that that's also a discussion topic here in Korea. But that's certainly one area where I'm aware that Australia is playing a leading role.
Absolutely. Well, before we wrap up, as you mentioned, the role of AustCham Korea has changed from the way beginning to now. Do you see a future goal? Let's say in 10 years' time, could you share with us the goal of AustCham Korea and your vision for the Korea-Australia economic cooperation?
I think it really goes back to what I said earlier around awareness. I think the definition of success is where the awareness both here in Korea but also in Australia has reached a level of maturity that we see continued growth in the relationship, not just at an economic level, but also at a social and cultural level. I think underpinning all of this is people-to-people exchanges.
Yeah, absolutely. Todd, do you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree. And I think, as you mentioned, with people, we already have a large community of Koreans both living in Australia and traveling to Australia to study. And we hope that also turns into a two-way street because obviously now Korean universities are starting to attract more foreign students and there are places here and hopefully there's increased interest in this market from not just a company perspective, but from an individual perspective and a student perspective as well. Because compared to when you and I both arrived here, it's much easier now for foreign people to integrate into a university or into a small company or even start their own business here. So hopefully that level of awareness that you mentioned will continue to grow. And both nations can prosper.
Absolutely. Going beyond awareness, and now we're going forward to make these businesses boom and prosper and making the steps, ensuring that these steps take place safely and in an exciting way, certainly. Thank you once again for joining us. That's all the time we have for today. If you guys have any questions or comments regarding Korea's economy and what goes on around the world, feel free to join us on social media where we'd love to answer your curiosities. We'll be here same time next week, same time, same place. Thank you again.